I'm probably the newest author on the panel. My name is Jennifer Marie Brissett, and I have a book coming out from Aqueduct, hopefully September, October, somewhere in there. The title of it is Elysium, and you can remember because there was a movie. But let's see, this should be pretty self-contained, I hope, so I don't think I'm going to do any introduction of it. And I'm not used to reading sitting down.
Stand up.
Stand up.
Stand up.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Get up.
Yeah. And my voice is a little foggy because it's a little early for me. And here we go. They started as little nubs burrowing out of her back. At first, they itched like tiny insect fingers crawling up and down just under her shoulder blades. She tried to ignore them. Then she tried to hide them. Even the thick sweater with the holes in it couldn't cover the growing bumps. Adrian didn't say anything to her father. He so desperately wanted her to be normal. She didn't know how to tell him that it was happening to her too. He was so busy worrying about finding their next meal that he didn't seem to notice her strange behavior. There was a sweet pain in knowing that she was becoming like him. She wasn't sure that he'd see it like that. Whenever her father flew away, he told her how much he hated to leave her alone. Adrian always knew that he was not leaving just to look for food. He was leaving to look for people. He still believed that there were folks holed up somewhere out there, survivors, folks like them with their minds still intact. He wanted to find them and maybe form a community, maybe even rebuild a little of what once was. Adrian had doubts that she kept to herself. She watched him open his wings high on the morning breeze and coast into the purple sky, ascending and flapping, flutter, flutter. He had been gone for almost 3 days. She tried not to worry. It was hard when he was away that long. The mist was thick again. She hoped he could see his way home. He was probably in one of the bombed-out buildings, waiting until the heat of the morning burned off the fog. But he'd come back. He always came back. Home was a high-rise building. It was a shell of his former self, a metal skeleton. Broken glass was everywhere. Papers and the insides of computers were strewn all over the floors. They had cleaned up when they arrived and made themselves as comfortable as possible. Adrian used one of the offices for her room. She liked having a door. It meant privacy. She needed that, or so she thought. She spent her days reading and writing in a journal, a leather-bound fancy thing that she found in the office supply closet. A pigeon cooed and landed on the lead outside her broken window. It poked its head in and jauntily hopped across the metal frame. It flapped its wings and took to the air. She watched it, a gray dot against the purple sky. She had a fire going in a small metal waste paper basket. It kept her warm against the cold. Her father had showed her how to make it without burning the whole building down. She stoked it with rubbish found around the office, memos, contracts, order forms, and other nonsense. Sometimes she read the memos to such and such about something or another complaint or redress or whatever. They wrote that stuff like it was so important. She crumpled it up, threw it into the fire, and watched it curl up brown and blacken to ash. She remembered how, on a night like this, her mom once told her a story from back home. As she tucked her into bed, her eyes wide and fingers stretched for emphasis. Pitney jumped from sound she heard and peered from wall to wall to see the ghost that should appear from out the entry hall. Grinning teeth stained red with blood, Pitney was sure she'd seen. Yellow and long and sharp they were, from out the darkness gleamed. Thunder clapped and the lightning struck, shaking the window frame. She died beneath the sheets and hid before the monster came. Pitney watched the sun rise up, but no duckies came to call. So what caused her this night of fright? Granny's stew peas was all. By the end, they were both giggling uncontrollably, with her mother tickling her belly while telling her that it was time to sleep. Now those days were gone. She had the story, but not her mom, and the story wasn't funny anymore. At least she knew that nothing was in the building with her except the pigeons. They strung empty cans on computer cables along all the stairways. They'd make a hell of a racket if something were to come across them. In the early days, all their time was spent fortifying the barricades. Office furniture and mostly anything they could carry barred the entryways to their floor. If anything got through, her father said that he could carry her in her arms and fly away. And if he wasn't there, she had to go up to the roof and fire the flare gun. He'd come get her. He promised that wherever he was, he'd come get her. Seemed like a dubious plan, but Adrian hadn't argued. She knew he meant well. He was doing the best he could. Her father returned, coasting with his long wings circling as he made his descent through the window of their floor. Adrian folded into his arms and stayed there, not wanting to let go, as he patted her on the head and said, "I told you I'd come back. I always come back for you, baby. I always come back." She treasured the sound of his voice, every utterance, every word, every syllable. He was barefoot and looked a little bruised. Adrian noticed that he had lost more of his facial hair. His face seemed extra smooth. He stopped shaving a while ago because his beard had stopped growing. Now the hair on his head was going, almost gone. And something about his bone structure had changed too. More of his jawline could be seen and his head was longer, more stretched out. He pulled from her arms and said, "I've got a surprise for you." He drew out of his pocket a tiny, tiny kitten, so small that it fit into the palm of her hand. Its eyes were filled with terror, but it stretched out its neck when she scratched it with her finger. It folded itself into her arms and was so exhausted that it fell asleep. He unwrapped a blanket filled with food he brought back. He had all kinds of stuff, cans of soup, crackers, peanut butter, enough to keep them going for weeks. He'd found a live chicken somewhere. He cracked its neck and brought it along. Adrian felt queasy watching him pull off its feathers. It seemed like preparing to eat a distant cousin or something. But they needed the protein and it was gonna die out there anyway. They had a feast that night. The smell of the cooking warmed Adrian from the inside. After dinner, her father felt so good he launched into telling stories about the old days when he went to the club uptown and wore his fine clothes. Then he hummed out an old tune while Adrian kept rhythm by clapping hands. He got up and danced without a care in the world. Adrian couldn't help laughing. It was a good time. Their bellies were full and the cat was curled up asleep by the fire, and they were safe and they were together. The cans from far below in the building rattled, a loud cry from outside. They had forgotten themselves. Their dad quickly doused the fire and Adrian grabbed the kitten. They went into the furthest corner of the office and huddled in the dark. The sounds outside grew louder and louder. Her daddy's wings covered them like a shield. Slowly the howls became distant and faded away. Early the next day, Adrian watched her father fly into the mist. He was going out to look for survivors again. He didn't say it, but Adrian knew that what he was going to do. It was as if he admitted that if it were people he were looking for instead of food, he would be admitting that they were most likely all alone. Her father refused to accept that. He needed to believe that people could survive and still be sane out there, living life like them. He didn't want to raise Adrian in a world devoid of life. So far, all he found were things that he didn't want to talk about. Adrian had long ago given up believing that there were anyone else left. If there were people out there, they would have found signs of them already, or she thought. She kept her doubts to herself. They held each other close before he said goodbye. He reminded her about the flare gun and that she should go to the roof and fire it off if there was any trouble. He would come right away, he said, and she believed him, or at least she tried to believe him. The nubs pushed and pulled and squeezed past her shoulder blades in the night. She sweated with pain as the nubs emerged through her skin. She twisted and turned and screamed. It was so cold now that the winter had finally come. She could see smoke clouds steaming out of her mouth as she threw off her sweater, and the thin arms covered with feathers painfully stretched out of her back. Her dad wanted her to be normal. How could she let him see that the mist had worked its magic on her too? The orange morning warmed her cold sweat, and her wings were fully outside of her body. The feathers were light and the color of ivory. She stretched them to their full expanse. They had started out so small. It took only a few hours for them to grow as wide as she was tall. She didn't greet her dad when he came home. She hid in her room with only the kitten to keep her company. A knock on the door. He didn't wait for her to say, "Come in." He just did. His wings brushed against the door frame. They were not like hers. They were bigger, and his feathers were gray with speckles of black splashed everywhere. He held a metal bowl with dinner in it. He sat down next to her without saying a word. He handed her the bowl and folded his legs and looked off into the distance. A big broken window in her room faced the city, so they could watch the darkness fall as the sun went down. By squinting, Adrian could almost pretend that the city was still alive and there were people in the buildings, working late and calling for Chinese food or packing up and getting ready to go home or getting dressed for a night out. You know, living and doing what folks used to do in the city. The illusion faded and reality slipped through. Those were broken buildings out there. Lights came on because some automatic generators were still working. That wouldn't last for much longer. The city was empty, urban shadow, a ghost. Her bowl was warm and smelled good. There was some rice and beans in it and a spicy sauce her dad was good at making. She tepidly spooned some into her mouth. The gravy was salty sweet against her tongue. She felt her every grain of rice. She closed her eyes and absorbed herself in the moment. "So they came in, huh?" he said. Adrian winced. The food in her mouth turned to mush. She didn't want to eat anymore. He put his arms around her and kissed her on the forehead. "No need to be ashamed, baby," he said. "It just means you take after your old man." This made Adrian smile, so a tear rolled down her cheek before she could catch it. "Why is this happening?" she asked. "Why are we changing like this?" He sat in the quiet for a while as he thought how to answer. "I think somewhere out there someone touched the buttons they shouldn't have touched. I don't know who and I don't know where, but that's what I think happened." "Why would somebody do something like that?" "Baby," he said and sighed deep, "there are people that just don't care. They do what they want when they want. Other folks just don't figure into their equation." He swallowed and leaned in and put his head on hers. She put down her bowl and found a place under his chin to rest her forehead. She could smell his smell. It was her daddy's smell, a sweet, musky scent that filled her nose and made her feel safe. "Before all this, my biggest problem was finding a job," he said. "I looked and looked, and there was always someone more qualified, someone with more education, someone better. I beat those streets like they had done something to me to find work. A black man never stood a chance in this city. They fixed it that we always got a raw deal. Then all of this happened, and none of that mattered anymore. Now all I want to do is to protect you." He kissed her tenderly on the forehead again. "I want you to have a future," he said, wiping away the flow from his nose and eyes. "All I want is for you to be all right. And these here rings, that's just something that happens. Maybe they'll be the only thing that'll happen to you, and that's all right. I've seen things out there, baby girl, people twisted into all kinds of shapes." Touched her on the head and said, "I'm sorry for the world I'm leaving you. You got to be strong now. You got to be stronger than strong." He got quiet. She wanted to ask him what he had seen. She wanted to know what more might happen to her body and what more had happened to his. She knew he didn't have the answers, so she said nothing. "Tomorrow I'll take you with me on a food run," he said to her surprise. "Really?" "Yeah, really. You got wings now. You might as well learn how to use them. I'll teach you, and then you'll come with me." She swallowed. "But Daddy, what if I can't fly? Mine might not work as good as yours." "There's only one way to find out, isn't there?" he said. She touched her dad's hand and he said, "Whoops, it actually worked." Sorry. She touched her dad's hand and he said, "You should eat your dinner before this."